So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session. This is our Tech Future, Promise or Peril. And I'm pleased to announce that we're going to have both of those. You get some promise and some peril. So my name is Jesse Bump. I'm at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the US. I'm an American citizen. I come from a cattle farm, and I'm trained as an epistemologist, so I study the history of knowledge, who gets to create it, what they do with it, and in most cases, how we resist that. So we're joined today by an all-star panel. We have Olympian Hannah Barakat here. No joke, it's true, actual Olympian. Yeah, we have online, we have Anasuya Sengupta joining us from London, England at 3 in the morning. So maybe a little special round of applause. Yeah, 3 in the morning, we appreciate that. Thank you, Anasuya. And we have Erliani Abdul Rahman, and we have Smokneel Mehta. So what we'll do here is we'll run through the panel. They'll give you a minute or two introduction to say how each of them relates to tech. And then we'll tell you a story about the history of tech, the way data works, how it's getting used, and we will follow this arc so that we have some background in common so you can understand it. If you have any questions about that, just stick up your hands and we'll address them. And after our story, then we'll just have discussion for the rest of our time. So think about questions you'd like to ask, issues you want to clarify, anything you'd like, please raise it. So that's how we'll proceed. And I'll start by asking Hannah to introduce herself, and then we will go in the order that I mentioned.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Barakat. I'm a Palestinian-American researcher. My background's in human-computer interaction and science and technology studies, as well as international development studies. And my work examines how emerging technologies perpetuate harm, but also how communities in the global majority create resilient digital networks through decentralized technology. So for example, my research at Brown University has explored how Palestinians rely on digital networks to distribute critical safety-related information when traveling on the roads. At the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems, I looked at how misalignments in technology intended to target survivors perpetuate existing harm. And more recently, I've collaborated with advocacy groups, such as the National Domestic Workers Alliance, to center low-wage workers' perspectives on AI in the emerging home care sector as a form of preventative harm. In my other life, as Jesse mentioned, I'm a competitive runner. I ran at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, representing Palestine in the 100-meter sprint.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anasuya, and as Jesse mentioned, Sawadee Ka, Namaskar. Good morning from a very cold London while you're in a very warm and happy Bangkok. I wish I could be there with you, but I feel warm just being on this panel. I am a scholar and activist from India who now lives in London via San Francisco, where I worked at many different places and in many different ways, but including at the Global Fund for Women, which is Women's Human Rights Funder, as well as the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit that operates Wikipedia and its sister projects. And I will be coming back to Wikipedia in our conversation today. At this moment, well, for the past 8 years, I've been part of a feminist collective or nonprofit that I co-founded called Whose Knowledge, which, as the name suggests, is about asking the questions of power around knowledge and around tech. Whose knowledge? Whose tech? And how should those questions affect the ways in which we live our lives? Whose knowledge is it that controls our lives? Whose tech controls our lives? And how can we make it about all of us, for instance, in this room at PMAC, rather than just the internet of a few very privileged white men sitting in Menlo Park, California. That's me. Back to you, Lynn, I think.
Yes. Thank you, Anasuya. So I'm going to do a poll because I like to keep things interactive. So just by show of hands, how many of you were using Twitter back in the day when still called Twitter, before Elon Musk bought the platform, before October 22? Show of hands. Okay. So how many of you now still use the platform now called X under Elon Musk? Okay, great. I'm going to share my story of how I got involved at Twitter. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. So I was a diplomat for some time with the Singapore Foreign Service, and I pivoted 10 years ago to work on children's rights. I launched my own nonprofit in Singapore, and also at some point worked with the Nobel Peace Laureate Kailash Satyarthi in India. So I was running social media campaigns for him to tackle the issue of child trafficking and child sexual abuse in India. And that's how I came to the attention of Twitter. I was invited to join the Twitter Trust and Safety Council, and after 6 years, this is all I got. I resigned in December 2022 due to the meteoric rise in hate speech after Elon Musk bought the platform. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Swapnil. I am a postdoctoral associate at Boston University and MIT, where I do behavioral economics research. The road to get there has been very convoluted, so I've done my PhD in data science, worked at a couple of tech companies, including Twitter at the time when Musk was taking over, watching as one floor after another shut off their lights. Very interesting time. I have grown up in India, did my computer engineering there. I am a product of kind of a not so great education system where you get a degree, not really as much of an education. And so I've worked since then to try and improve that system and train students to use technology in positive ways for society. Several years later, I'm happy to report we've started a nonprofit. These students are now building technology tools for civil society organizations, working with the United Nations. In fact, actually reporting harms on online platforms that have been featured in national news and that have forced platforms to take down these networks due to public reporting of these harms, which is quite unusual for an undergraduate student to participate in. So I run a tech nonprofit called Sim People, where we simulate people and the interactions they have online. And as part and product of this tech nonprofit, we realized making technology sustainable sometimes needs you to figure out how to actually finance it. And we've spun out some technology ventures that are focused on healthcare and AI in India and Bangladesh. So I'm happy to talk about those kinds of things today.
Wonderful, thank you. So I realized I was a bit negligent in not telling you about my own relationship to technology. And it's actually fairly simple. When I was growing up, AI meant artificial insemination. So we were breeding cattle, and you could buy semen from other bulls, and it would come in this tank of nitrogen, and then you could use that to fertilize your cattle, and that's what we were doing to try to breed better stock. And one of the real truths about farming is that it's an incredibly empirical exercise. There's like heavy things and you lift them. It's not complicated. There's like big things and you break them, and then there's like small things and you put them together. There's an honesty of labor that it just supersedes any other concerns. And in that labor, there's a common humanity. So things are the same work for everybody. It gave me this sensibility that life should be fair. Like everyone should have the same kind of chance because we were all doing the same kind of work. And no matter how fancy you were or what kind of advantages you had, other people would have advantages too. So I brought that sensibility with me as I joined polite society. And I came to think of the digital side, tech, the internet, as the source of the most unfairness in society. And so I started to study it to figure out how something so useful could also perpetuate every underlying bias in society and then worsen them. So it was my curiosity that brought me into that. And I've stayed because I think it's still true. So what we'll do now is we'll narrate the story for you. And when we finish that, we'll turn to you for some questions. And I want to stress the importance of that because what we're trying to learn is collective. We have experts in various aspects of data tech, data science, but what we're trying to learn is about common experiences and the way the power of tech exerts itself over all of us. So do please feel empowered to ask questions, and no question is uninformed. All questions come from equal validity. Like, your experiences matter and we want to learn about them, and together we're going to talk about them and see if we can figure out some of the next layers in the evil tech onion. So with that, Hannah, please begin.
Yeah, I just wanted to start off by also echoing how I arrived at this space from the physical land. Growing up in Palestine, the physical landscape deeply informs how you can move. So whether you live in East Jerusalem or the West Bank or Gaza or inside the Green Line, all creates a different spatial reality. And I saw how architecture of walls, checkpoints, borders, and highways was a tool for limiting that movement. Growing up in the diaspora, I saw how my digital experience was a continuation of those physical checkpoints, seeing a fortress of invisible borders that surveilled, deplatformed, or in some cases limited access to cellular network to 2G or 3G to this day. And so my entry into this is really from a historical space of understanding how technology is a continuation of physical systems, but also how it's a continuation of existing ways of knowing and being. And so I became really inspired by the creative ways that Palestinians and also so many other communities in the global majority continue to use technology in creative ways that prioritize the collective health of the community over the individual. So my work really focuses on what it means to live under these oppressive physical and digital conditions. So with that being said, I really hope that my insights about Palestine and my lived experience cannot detract from and cannot be extracted from what we are witnessing in this moment. And while these conversations about promise and peril are so important, there's a real need for addressing the unprecedented violence we are currently witnessing and the need for immediate mutual aid and support on the ground. So with that being said, I wanted to start off with grounding the conversation on AI in the physical world. You know, we hear a lot about the promise and peril of AI. The reporting on it tends to sensationalize the potential advent. You know, it can cure diseases, but also simultaneously dramatizes the risk. It's going to lead to biomedical warfare or remove all jobs. And so part of this panel is to sort of ground us in what AI actually is and where we are today. So AI is not actually new. It's a continuation of existing digital systems and technologies that are able to identify and learn from patterns in data. So AI researchers have been studying these patterns for many years, dating back to the 1950s. And actually in the 1980s, there was an AI boom, not like the one we're seeing today, but one where computer scientists began to develop deep learning and expert systems, which allowed them to understand how computers can learn from their mistakes and make independent decisions. So then we have the early 2000s where we saw the rise of big data and virtual assistants, giving rise to early forms of AI like Siri on our phones or Google Maps, which updates roads based on the conditions of traffic. So AI is not new, but what is new is the speed and scale at which these systems are operating. This has allowed for generative AI, such as large language models like OpenAI or DeepSeek, to take hold. And we know that these systems do not operate in a vacuum. The creation, development, and production of these technologies is rooted in systems of colonialism, extraction, and environmental harms. You know, I think about the history of microchips, which began in Silicon Valley in the 1960s with the Fairchild Semiconductor Factory, which sought out cheap labor from indigenous Navajo women who had high skills in weaving rugs. And they took that labor and said, let's employ these women to physically weave together the microchips that went on to become some of the microchips that Intel uses. I'm also thinking about the origins of chatbots, which began, in the 1950s in the United States in psychiatric wards. And they were actually first developed to simulate conversations between psychotherapists and patients. We also see beyond the physical labor how extractive ideologies become encoded in these systems. Statistical models such as correlation, which is used to help some of these technologies identify connections between data points, stems from eugenicists like Francis Galton and Carl Pearson. We see all these scientists who believe that humans should be grouped and bred based on similar specific traits, actually underpin some of the technologies we rely on to analyze information. The list goes on. We think about text-to-image generation, models that we know and use, like Stable Diffusion, which were trained on child sexual abuse images, or even the early histories of sentiment analysis techniques, which hold origins in World War II internment camps in the United States, where Japanese internees were surveilled and grouped based on their behavior as positive, negative, or neutral as a form of control. So my goal here in highlighting these is to really underscore how these systems are social and technical, right? They're socio-technical. They can't be devoid from the context in which they're employed. And so my invitation to you all is not to think of AI technology as new, but rather as a continuation of things we're all familiar with in this room. And I believe Anasuya and Lynn will be able to explain a little bit more about the other ways we see some of this context playing out.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and particularly for starting us off in both the physicality of tech and the history of tech, and for us not to see this moment as a so-called disruption or a disjuncture, but actually a continuation of what I often call colonial capitalism. And the reason I use those two words together is for us to remember that capitalism, which is the economy, the economic system that underpins all that we're talking about today, could not exist without the very violent and systematic extraction of resources and control of bodies in many of our countries and our continents across the world for over 250 years. And that form of colonialism, as Hannah talks about, continues today in places like Gaza, in other places across the world, where tech, unfortunately, has become, as it has always been in some ways, at the heart of the industrial military machine. And so even as we talk about promise, and I promise I will talk about promise, I want to honor exactly what Hannah said and come at it from a different but related perspective. And in some ways, I think about this moment of tech as also being not just older from a digital point of view, but also a physical point of view. I'm from India, and I grew up learning that the first major large-scale exercise in data collection by a state in collusion with industry was the British Census of India, right, in the late 1800s, where the people of South Asia were categorized. Some of those categories continue to affect us to this day, including in the ways the caste system was categorized. And as we know, the caste system is a social structure of oppression that is way before colonialism, but it continues through colonialism and it changes through colonialism. But here we are with the sense of India categorizing people. Then we have what I now call, in some ways, the first war of computing, which is World War II, in which IBM, for example, worked with the Nazi regime to create census counting machines that were able to identify Jews, that were able to identify queer folks, that were able to identify Romas, that were able to identify disabled people. And as we know, the genocide of those people occurred because they could be identified. IBM has never been held to account. And then, as Hannah mentioned, those forms of large-scale data collection used through technological systems get deployed in what is now being called the first AI war, which is the war in Gaza and Palestine, which is the ways in which the Israeli military are deploying algorithmic systems or machine learning systems to target Gazans. And so again, this sweep of how we use data, and I'll come back to it. In our work, we challenge, therefore, both what we call big tech, but also what we call big knowledge. And it's a little to what Jessie said earlier, which is, how do we think about the multiple ways in which we know and do and be in the world? Surely it's not just one way of knowing and being that we have in the world. As an Indian, I studied computer science. I was one of the first generations to study computer science at school. Swapnil may not remember because I think I'm a little older than you, Swapnil, just a little. But we used to take off our shoes, go into the computer room. It was set up like a temple because there were 5 of us to one computer, and that was probably very privileged even at that time. There was a big fan because we didn't have AC. And this magic box was our way into the rest of the world. And even though we were one of, at the time, most populous countries in the world, and now the most populous country in the world, I still felt growing up that I was on the margins of the world because I never saw myself. I never saw our people in the headlines of a newspaper unless it was about war or famine or some form of destruction, right? What does that mean for all of us who are thinking about how we live in the world and who we can, with what forms of dignity we can live? Now, a very simple example around this in the sort of digital world is Wikipedia. And I use this because I'm a Wikipedian, and we can talk more about that in our question and answer session. But I often talk about Wikipedia as the best of the internet and not yet the best of humanity. And the reason is this: Wikipedians, volunteers from around the world, create and curate information in multiple languages, in multiple contexts. One of the best known examples in the last few years has been about COVID. So all of you in the room will recognize this and know, especially because WHO and the Wikimedia Foundation had a partnership where Wikipedia editors edited COVID-related articles in sort of real time, so that by November 2021, there were nearly 7,000 articles in over 180 language Wikipedias. Now, why does that matter? It matters because if I was to read a COVID article in English, my way of understanding COVID is going to be very different from my way of understanding COVID if I was to read the article in Bangla or the article in Swahili, because the context is different, as Hannah said. Context matters. And what big tech often does is decontextualizes. It pulls us out of context. It extracts us, exactly as it extracts many other things from us, but it extracts us out of context. One last thought, and I'll come back to it later as well, is all of us in this room, I'm seeing myself as being in this room with you, speak many different languages. Lynn, I might ask you to ask that question. How many people in the room speak more than one language?
How many people in this room speak more than one language? There's quite a majority in the room.
There you go. All of us then know that when we speak in a different language, we know the world differently. We travel the world differently. We walk the world differently, right? When I'm speaking in Kannada or in Tamil, one of my languages, I know the world differently than when I'm speaking to you in English. And that's the same for Thai or the same for Mongolian, right? But again, what we think of as knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is often monolingual. Why is it we think that only if we can speak English, we are scientists? Why is it that peer-reviewed journal articles in science are more than 90% in English? There are more than 7,500 signed and spoken languages in the world. And yet there are only about 500 of those represented online in what we think of as public knowledge. What does that mean for how we think about knowledge at large, whether that is social knowledge, cultural knowledge, or scientific knowledge? Whose knowledge are we talking about? I leave it at that, and I know Lynn will take this further.
Thank you, Anasuya. For those of you who just joined us, I want to give a little bit of background about me. So I used to be in the Twitter Trust and Safety Council, and I resigned 2 years ago after Elon Musk took over the platform to protest against the meteoric rise in hate speech. So what I'll do right now is build upon what my colleagues Hannah and Anasuya have spoken about before me and give you an example about application in AI. So I've just written, I got published last night while we're here, a piece for Tech Policy Press. I wrote a piece calling out Elon Musk's appointment to the Department of Government Efficiency in the US, so a very specific US example. So if you want to go to the PMAC website, I mean, you can do it now or later, go on the speakers, find my name, Ilyani, and you click on the speakers document, you'll find the link to the article and also a PDF about it, so you can read about it in some detail. But I'll give you some highlights from that. So Elon Musk promised that he will cut at least $2 trillion from the US federal budget of $7 trillion by July next year. And this is all in the name of efficiency. But now, since Trump has gotten elected, he's revised the number down to about $1 trillion. But I argue in the article that we can basically trust Musk to deliver the public goods that we will expect from the government, because we can't trust that his way of looking at efficiency is what we want. Why do I say that? I have a problem with this approach. Efficiency, if you think about it, is basically for any given amount of input, you have the same level of output or more. That's efficiency. But this is an economic term. It does not take into any consideration issues like equity, decency, or the vulnerability of communities that are affected. This is why back in the US, people are very, very head up about this issue of how the DOGE, as it's called, the Department of Government Efficiency, is going to do the cuts that's needed in order to have this so-called efficiency. So that's one, efficiency. The second piece is that Musk has said that he would use advanced technology, i.e. code word for AI, in order to do this work. So here I'm going to take a quick pause, because like I said before, I like things to be interactive. So how many of you saw the video yesterday in the opening session about the generative AI that was masquerading as a child? You know, the one of the video child and the parents and okay, good. So most of you, quite a few of you in the room. I think it was a very interesting video because there's this sociologist called Ruha Benjamin at Princeton University, and she has argued that we need to train AI, give it machine learning, AI, like a child. Why do I say that? Why is that important? Because as my colleagues have said before me, data is not neutral. So again, going back to the US where I live, over there we have this term called redlining. So that's a term that banks use to try and rate potential homeowners, right? The risk of lending to these potential homeowners based on neighborhood demographics like race and ethnicity. So not based on individual creditworthiness, based on demographics of race and ethnicity. Why is that a problem? And this term redlining literally means the practice of drawing red lines physically onto the map. So when we talk about AI, what we're really talking about is using past historical data to try and predict future events. But if your data has a history of redlining, if it has a history of embedded racism in it, so for example, in the case of healthcare in the US, we have a history of segregated medical facilities, we have a history of racist medical curricula, you're actually entrenching the bias when you build AI models. You're actually doing it at speed. So I give an specific example. In 2021, the death rates, maternal death rates of Black women was 2.6 times higher than that of white women. And the CDC said that this is due to a bunch of factors, but basically due to structural racism and implicit bias. So, my friends, if we're using this same data in order to so-called, we think it's predicting the future, we're not predicting the future, we're repeating the past.
Thank you. And in that vein, let's talk about tech companies. So I come from a background where I used to work for Oxford with Meta once upon a time on bot detection, and then got a couple of grants from Google and worked with their teams to understand trust and safety stuff. I worked with Twitter on early detection of misinformation at the time. When Brazil had elections, I was trying to figure out how to create systems that could at least flag uh, content that could be potentially harmful. And in doing that, I recognized that I also worked at Slack and Adobe and all of those companies. But the bottom line is, I think when you work inside and outside of tech companies, you have a very different view of one, the amount of power they wield over users, two, the way systems and teams and structures are set up within companies, and three, the kind of ability for change or flexibility that a company carries. I want to present a contrarian opinion. People at companies are good. People at a lot of these tech companies have the right intent. They joined to actually drive positive change in ways that is actually beneficial to society. And a lot of those people have been able to do that. What I think arises as a challenge is not that the intent is not there, it's that the culture that is propagated, and a lot of that comes down to leadership, is not going in ways that people who had the intent actually envisioned when they joined. And then suddenly, in a lot of cases, you're in a situation where you don't have the flexibility to magically change the place you're in, change the role you're in, and change the work you're doing. And a lot of people have spent years pushing back against these systems. But as a lot of people here in government will know, systems are very hard to change, especially when you don't have leadership buy-in. So a lot of the conversations going on even within tech companies even today are, how do you actually push back against this in a sustainable way? Because at the end of the day, you're an employee at a company. You're a fungible asset. The more you push back, the more you open yourself up to not remaining in the company anymore. And for a lot of people who are on visas, who are international, it's not an option for appending your life and moving out. I think a lot of times in the past, even in the present, technology is built in the West and thrust upon the rest. We don't build tools that are explicitly catering first to populations outside of the West and then take those to Western audiences for multiple reasons, one of which is the business case for it needs to be really strong. Simply put, a user in the West for a tech company holds a higher monetary value than a user outside. If you talk about economics, it doesn't make sense for companies to invest in those users unless there is scale. The one thing that the global majority has by default, in fact, in most contexts, is scale. I can talk about India, right? The problems that we have are so unique because of the scale at which solutions need to be deployed. And that's why a lot of these problems don't get solved like that. They take years to try and even move the needle on. I want to point out a few things when it comes to deploying technology, especially relevant to the organizations that are here. When we deploy interventions, we treat populations as a sample. We often forget that these are real people that we are deploying technology for. We call them beneficiaries. And I say we because I'm also part of this process. I've also learned the same things in the same ways, and now I'm trying to question them. When you deploy a successful intervention, when it really works, when health technology actually reaches people, I would ask you to question, who is the real beneficiary? Is it the people who the intervention is being deployed for, or is it the person who actually built it, who gets all these laurels, goes around to nice conferences, talks about it, and builds a career out of those? I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's not a clean sample to those of you who are thinking about those things, right? We have deployed so many interventions to so many villages, rural areas, populations, that it's not the first app you've created that is deploying AI in a village for students to learn education. it is the 19th application that they have to download on their smartphone because someone told them that this is a new intervention that we've come out with now that Gen AI has become a fad and we need to deploy this. Everyone in this room has now heard of chatbots, right? Conversational AI systems. How many of us are monitoring the behaviors that having a chatbot induces? You monitor the behavior of audiences on your websites. You understand what sessions they have when they come to your website. You understand what content they consume. What about the conversational AI systems that you're deploying? Like, how do you understand how that changes and moves the needle on behaviors? And I say that because even going back to tech companies, Mark Zuckerberg said once upon a time that if this is a spectrum of, like, this is a threshold of where I'm going to draw the line on content I will allow and not allow, if I draw a line here, behaviors won't be uniformly distributed within the bounds that I confine. Behaviors will almost always aggregate just before the line is drawn. So wherever you're drawing the line, think about the fact that you are implicitly conditioning people to say, hey, you can almost cross this kind of speed limit. If I draw the speed limit at 50, people are most likely going to stop at 49, not evenly before at 10, 20, 30, 40. So think about these lines that you're drawing, think about the populations that you're catering to, and think about who the real beneficiaries of technology interventions are when you go out and deploy those in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to each of our panelists. We've now got lots of time for questions. And as I said, this is an opportunity to try to seek some truth from a 3D perspective. So if you have any questions, please use the microphones. That way, Anasuya can hear you and you go to the recording. But yes, perfect. Oh, no, there's a free-floating microphone. So yeah, please go ahead.
It's on.
Can we have this microphone that's from the case?
Hello. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Used to the old way of tapping. I thought, before coming to this room, that AI could be the great balancer of injustice, bringer of injustice. If it cannot, as I think the panelists have shown, then what can we do to make AI a more of a balancer of injustice? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question.
I like that question. So for me, when I give talks like this, I like to talk about futurities. That means what we envision of the future, and how then do we move backwards to the present and disrupt the present. So like what Swani was saying, I agree also, but sometimes I feel when I am in space with other people who are doing tech, I feel that they're always talking about constraints of what they know. And so because I'm an indigenous woman, so I'm from the Malay archipelago, present-day Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. We think differently. So Anasuya was talking about that earlier. How do we talk about other ways of knowing and adapting those kind of knowledges into how we build AI models, how we think about different things? I think you're going to talk about binaries at some point. But basically, some of the things that we do is very binary, right? Let's just think about the Gaza. It's war or peace. It's binary. Well, how we code is 0 or 1. In my culture, when we think about decision making, so data, as I shown you, is not neutral. But when we think about data and processing information and building in AI models, for Malays, we include feelings when we make a decision. In the neocolonial knowledge production, we divorce that. It's a binary thing of reason versus feelings. And accordingly, we think data is then objective, but AI is not objective, and neither is data. It's not neutral. So for me, think about other ways of knowing and beings and disrupt what we know of neocolonial knowledge production, because there are ancient knowledges in this room. Thailand, for example, is the fount of knowledge in so many different areas. So for me too, I always am very careful how we look at this. For me, it's a societal challenge. So it's not just people who code, not just programmers. I'm an economist, for goodness sake, and I would spend most of my time being a diplomat. So do I have a space in this room? Yes, I think so. because we bring all our lived experiences and our qualifications to this challenge, because it takes a different thing. Okay, I will stop talking, but basically what I want to say also is that technology, right, is in spurts and starts. We as humankind have seen this before. So think about the Gutenberg press in 1455, right? So from monks writing the Bible in hand and calligraphy, and it takes up 1,000 years. With the printing press, it's quick. And suddenly the literate masses in Europe could start reading the Bible on their own, so relying on the priests. And then you have the radio, and then you had broadcasting, then the internet, and now us and the AI. We have seen this before, so we can do this again.
I really appreciate this question. A lot of my research looks at when we don't need optimized high-tech solutions. And one example to ground this is how Palestinians navigate when driving on the roads. So driving holds a series of physical challenges. Your ID, your license plate, your profession, all change which roads you can access and when. And so this has been a challenge for a while. There's flying checkpoints, there's road blockers, it can lead to death, it can lead to violence. And it seems like a solution that tech would be good at. You can map the roads, you can share information with people, maybe you can build a technology that is identity specific. So if you have a certain type of ID, you can know which roads you would want to drive on. And so I spent 2 years looking at this challenge. What does Palestinian-owned technology startups trying to make identity-specific routes look like? And I spoke with the founder of Darub Navigator. And Darub Navigator is a tech startup that uses early artificial intelligence to create identity-specific routes when driving on the roads. And what they found was that there's layers of challenges because AI likes to decontextualize information. So for instance, if you have a user who has permits from the West Bank, but is a commercial driver and will drive into Israel, and they report a road blockage, the AI struggles to identify who else might find that information useful because the maps themselves are not reliable. So once again, the problem is not just the technology not being able to decipher context, but the history of data, which is bias. We don't have maps that reflect Palestinian ways of traveling due to bias in Apple Maps and Google Maps and limitations with satellite under the Kyle Brigham Amendment. So then I said, okay, well, what is an alternative? What have we been using? And growing up in Palestine, and maybe in many of the places you all are from, WhatsApp is actually the ideal form of communication. So I asked why. And it's because information has always been and will continue to be rooted in trusted social relationships. So when traveling on the road, people share information about updates, and this is preferred because you're able to see the person's last name, where they're from, who their mutual connections are, what village they're from, and it creates a trusted social network where people are organically vetted. So rather than placing your trust in the technology itself that some web developer in Silicon Valley has built, you're placing your trust in your community. And technology here is a tool to increase that community conversation. The second thing that became clear is the importance of visual epistemologies, which Lynn and Anasuya have talked about. In Palestine, we navigate our space through understanding the physical landscape. Rather than using Cartesian coordinates, identifying street names, or relying on Cartesian maps, we use perceptual knowledge to decipher the landscape. So the trees planted often signify if it's a settlement or a Palestinian village. The architecture of the road signifies if it's an Israeli-built road or a more historical Palestinian road. You can see based on the color of the license plate in the photos. So often you go on these WhatsApp groups and the entire WhatsApp group is just images. There's no text. And everyone in the group knows what this means. If you know, is kind of the vibe. And it speaks to the realities of navigating a landscape where historical data is not accurate and cannot reflect the precarity we face. So even in a situation where I spoke with Mohammed Abdul Halim, who created Darub Navigator, the challenges he's facing with AI is that this historical data is no longer applicable within 24 hours. This is constantly evolving, and the information about updating what that looks like has real ramifications. So something as boring as like a traffic update, if it's wrong, can lead to someone being rooted into a settlement where they're now being shot at. And so here you see how the physical and the digital divide collapse, and how digital information can have very serious real-world applications.
If I can jump in, sorry, I know we said all four wouldn't answer the same question, but this was too tempting a question to jump in.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Really quick, I think human-centered design will be the way to go, because human-centered design is agnostic of technology. It doesn't matter what technology you throw at a problem. If you don't design the solution well, it is not going to work. If your solution in most cases does not save people time, that will be friction that most of them cannot afford to actually adopt that kind of solution. And I'll give you a clear example of this. Either yesterday, today, or tomorrow, each of you are going to have some engineer or some technical team come up and say, why don't we build chatbots for this? Why don't we use AI to cater to all the queries that are coming in from your users? The first question I request you to ask them is, do you know what queries are coming in? Because I guarantee in most cases, a subset of questions will be repeated a majority of the time. Because that's how people's queries evolve. Like most people have the same questions. That's why we built education systems with a fixed syllabus, because we know most of the people need to know this subset of knowledge and the rest they can figure out on their own. So when these queries come in, almost in all cases, when you're designing these kinds of chat systems, all you can do is say, here are the 10 queries I really want to answer. The rest, I will redirect them to an FAQ where the rest of the 20 are buried. And it's not an optimal solution, but it will cost you no money. Versus the AI systems that you will not only invest 12 months in building out, but another 24 months in debugging, and then 36 months dealing with user complaints about this AI not working. So in almost all cases, human-centered design, in my opinion, is the robust way to deploy any technological solutions, without which you're not going to get anywhere. Thanks.
Thank you.
May I jump in as well, Jess?
So Anasuya, we have another question, and why don't we take that question, and if you prefer, you can answer this last one. Yeah, please, Mai.
So thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives, and I think the case studies or the examples that you provided were so powerful, and I think, to use your language, like physicalizing AI into our society and the way that we interact with it. So this is a little bit more of a personal question, because I think sometimes it can be overwhelming to understand the inherent violent roots and extraction of a lot of the technologies that we use today. So for example, every day when I put on sunscreen now, I think about how sunscreen was first developed by the military so that they could better conquer places where people's skins could not adapt as quickly to the climates in which they were trying to colonize. But I also want to use sunscreen. So I think my question is a bit more of a personal one, and I understand everyone navigates this differently. And Lynn, to your point, like, this is not the first time in history, but sometimes we think about these things on a very system level. And so I'd love just to hear from an individual, personal level, understanding that everyone has different boundaries and things that they're navigating. What are some of the questions that you would ask yourself as you're engaging in these technologies and the inevitable usage of AI?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Anasuya, we'll give you your choice of it. I wanted to clarify the sunscreen. For those of you who aren't historians of skincare products, during the Korean War, the US wanted to protect its soldiers in a really sunny environment. So they had this experience from World War II where diseases were one of the main obstacles, including sunstroke. So in the Korean War, they started to develop this secret chemical compound that could protect fair-skinned people in tropical places. So sunscreen, which is often a very helpful product for ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, it's part of the extension of empire. At its root, that's what it is. It doesn't mean that every time you lotion up, you are advocating for an imperial world order. It's just, that's why money went into that question. And that's why there is not a skincare product for people who weren't in the US military. Not everybody needs skincare, but you can think about a skin barrier to a caustic environment. That everybody needs. We don't have it. That's not what was at the heart of empire. So there's the sunscreen part. Now, Anasuya, which question would you like to answer, or take them both if you want to?
I may end up responding to both because they're both excellent questions. Thank you. And perhaps to start with the question around how do we imagine an AI system that works for justice, and then come to this very beautiful question to us around our own personal practice. I think Hannah, Lynn, Swapnil brought up so many different versions of how I think about this. And I want to, especially to all of you who try to do good every day in your work and in your personal lives, always ask you the question that Lynn asked us, which is, what is the world we want to live in, right? We don't, if we start with the question, what is the tech we want? We'll end up with pizza apps, like Swapnil said, right? We always have to ask ourselves, what are we here for? What is the world we want to live in? What are the healthy systems of living we want, right? To all of you. And then we reverse engineer to what is going to get us there. And that will be multiple forms of relationship, human relationship, different forms of technological systems, perhaps not. As Hannah said, maybe the technologies that we use are different, but what is the question that we ask ourselves around imagination? Hannah used such a poignant example of driving, and Swapnil talked about speed limits. I'm going to use that in a slightly different way. We know that when, and this is true even now, we know that when accidents happen, car accidents happen, women are 17% more likely to die in those accidents and 71% more likely to be injured. Now, why is that? Because the crash test dummies that were used were the crash test dummies based on 6-foot-tall American men. Very similar to the question around skincare and sunscreen, right? Who is this for? It was never for women, it was never around different bodies. Now we could say, okay, so the way to solve for this is to have us design for women's bodies. But which women's bodies? Which bodies? What if we were to say, the question is different? We bring into a room a whole range of people with many different forms of body, many different forms of contexts of driving in different forms of vehicles, in different forms of places, with many different backgrounds. And we ask them the question, what would well-being and safety look like while you drive? The answer to that question may not be a seatbelt. It may be something enormously more creative and much more just. And so the similar thing around personal practice is that we and I, in my work, but also in my personal life, keep asking myself the question, what am I doing this for? And then I reverse engineer. So in terms of tech, the principle I use, or the protocol I use, is of ease versus ethics, because it's never an easy decision, exactly as Swapnil is talking about. These are not simple binary decisions. They're decisions on a continuum. So my continuum is, on the one hand, ease, and the other is ethics. And I keep asking myself, okay, what am I prioritizing at this moment in time? So just as an example, when we first started our collective, we said, do we use Google? Really? Do we use Google? And, you know, there are very many reasons why we shouldn't use Google, and all of us may know them. But at the heart of our work, because we are for knowledge justice, we do collaborative writing with people around the world from different communities. And Google is still the easiest form of collaborative writing. People understand Google, people have Gmail addresses, they know what it means to be in a Google Doc. So we said, okay, what we're prioritizing here is the ease of the collaborative writing, the ethics of working with our communities really collaboratively, but what we're losing is the ethics of tech, of the kind of tech that we want to be in, because for us, we try and use free and open source software and free and open source tech as much as possible. And also in terms of security. So now what we do is the writing work happens in Google, and other things that we think are about security and privacy of the people we work in, we use other technologies and other storage systems. But that conversation around ease versus ethics is an ongoing conversation. It's not a static conversation. And that's one of the ways in which I live my life at this moment. And to the AI question, I have tried ChatGPT. I try all of these things because one should not talk about them without trying them. And I do not work with them after that because I don't want to feed the machine. So that's my personal practice.
Thank you, Anasia. And my thank you for your question. So I'm going to address it now. You asked us what is our own personal journeys in relation to how we get on this path of data and relationship with data. And for me, it's like one step back. What is my identity? So for me, it's only like 2 years ago that I started to acknowledge that I am actually indigenous. I'm from Singapore and I also have Chinese. And then it was easier for me growing up to pretend that I was part of the mainstream society, because to acknowledge the losses of my people was very hard to do. So for me, then acknowledging that I'm actually indigenous is only a 2 years ago thing, and then bringing my own lived experience and my identity fully into the room, which we're not encouraged to do, by the way, in neocolonial knowledge production, right? Because we're supposed to be objective, we're not supposed to be in the room, the knowledge is not situated in our local context, all of that. I want to disrupt that. So we have a Malay word. I presented on this last year at PMAC, and hopefully you were not there in attendance, but the Malay word is amok. You know, like in the phrase like running amok, going crazy. In my culture, that was a defense mechanism to defend our lands from the colonizers. The British were so scared of us that they took it, even though it was a martial strategy, right? So we talked about it in royal courts, we decided a point together, we then gathered all our weapons, the villages would send them off, the warriors would go to war to their deaths to defend our land. This happened. The British were so scared of us that they took it and they made it into an individual disease. That as late as 2013, it was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's issued by the American Psychiatric Association. Imagine in 2013, as a Malay, as a descendant, to open the book, and it says that amok, endemic to the primitive island nation states of this part of the world, quote unquote. So I want to reclaim that. So when I talk about tech and stuff, I want to resist and refuse. And how do we do that in a way that will make sense? Especially right now, because I live in the US, in this current political climate. So with tech, and with tech, what we see the tech collusion and politics, how do I do that? So that's something that I'm actually trying to figure out. How do I resist? How do I refuse? Another thing that I was talking about with Jessie before we came to this panel is we are here in this room. We're learning from one another. For me, it's about decoloniality. How do I bring my decolonized knowledge and bring other ways of knowing, and then disrupting tech doing this? This is what I've just learned the last 2 years. It took me decades to get here. How do we get other people to join us in this thing and get it there quicker than we did? Because the losses are real. If we don't do something about AI and how it's developed, for example, in the US, for example, the guardrails against AI have been removed. President Trump has signed an executive order repealing what Biden has done to put guardrails around AI. That's gone. So the harms are for real. And so for me, that's something that I'm struggling with right at the moment.
Thank you for sharing that. I am also thinking about what it means in this moment to be using AI in addition to the environmental impacts, which have been discussed throughout this conference. Something else I'm kind of curious about, and maybe some of you all in the audience have examples, or you in the panel, my panelists have other examples, is how we can use AI not to predict the future, but to interrogate the past. And so thinking about subverting the gaze, right? We have all of this data, and I'm curious about examples of communities who have historically been harmed that can creatively leverage the ability to identify patterns in ways that help them. So for instance, I've been working with low-wage workers who are notoriously taken advantage of by gig app platforms. They're delayed in terms of payments, and some really creative examples of AI include using basic elements of machine learning to scan their pay stubs, aggregate them over large amounts of other workers, and reveal how wage theft is happening. Or maybe I'm thinking about artists who are creatively developing solutions to integrate pixels into their digital art before uploading them onto the internet, so that if an AI system were to come and take that art and try to train on it, some of those pixels might actually act as a way of breaking the model in chaotic or unpredictable ways. And that's a tool called Nightshade. Hugging Face, for instance, had worked on a project called Stable Bias, where they scraped a lot of the AI-generated images of DALL-E and Stable Diffusion and interrogated what cultural biases were showing up in these images. So rather than using AI to say, how do we create a future, we can use AI to identify patterns that we know through our collective knowledge exist, but maybe we now have some proof for it. But I'm curious to hear how some of my co-panelists are thinking about that, if it resonates with you at all.
I guess I'm left, but I want to point out we have time for more questions, so you can absolutely walk up and interrupt me, and I would rather hear your question than my answer. 30 seconds for a brave soul to walk up. I can keep talking. Please go ahead.
Good morning, I'm Kritin, and I'm a fourth-year medical student from Siraj Hospital. So in the past several years, we've seen significant disruption in terms of job replacement by AI. How far do you think this will continue? Could it reach a point that it destabilizes the traditional economic structure? And should this be controlled, and what can we do about it?
Ooh, this is a great question. Okay, so I'm a behavioral economics postdoc. I was a data science PhD student, and I was a computer engineering undergrad. So kind of throughout a tech guy that happened to fall into social science and now economics. And I can give you a couple of perspectives there. I don't think I have a long-term answer, and I think anyone who has a long-term answer might be lying to you given the pace of progress that AI has had in the last couple of years, simply because they don't have the evidence to prove what is going to happen in the future. Right? So from my standpoint, I've seen two camps of people: techno-optimists and people who like their jobs. I think one of the reasons that AI has had such a fear that it has spread throughout the community is because AI is really good at automating away mundane tasks. And a lot of people who didn't have a massive creative component to their jobs, and they had very repetitive recurring tasks that were not requiring a lot of time to complete each time, but rather requiring time to complete many times. That's the kind of job that AI might become good at automating. But in a number of different studies, what we've found is AI is much more beneficial to people who are experts at their job already. For the simple reason that imagine you were doing your job and you had all these tasks and you had an RA to complete those jobs. AI is in, I've said this before, so let me remember exactly what I framed it as. AI is an Ivy League educated intern that is your boss's child. So you can treat AI, you have to treat it very nicely. It has an education that is decent, and I just used Ivy League as a kind of common example, but like many other institutions, not perpetuating any biases here, just cracking a joke. But the point is, I think the better you are at your job, the more AI can help you advance yourself in that role. I'm not saying AI is not going to automate jobs. It is and has automated away a lot of jobs. The question is, how are we training the population to adapt itself to this technological intervention that has kind of been thrust on us in the last year and a half, to the point where it is now democratized? And I think education is going to be the answer there to a lot of problems, especially the issue that a lot of students these days, when you go to them and ask them, what do you want to do? They're like, I want to work at a Google. I want to work at a Microsoft. I want to work at what XYZ company. However, the interview process for these companies is kind of another syllabus that you can learn in 90 days and get really good at. And so what these students don't realize is what their career ambition has been is actually a 4 to 5 year process of achieving it. And then once you get in, you realize, oh, this was not the promised land that I was supposed to get into, and like the world would be a better place after this, and so on and so forth. So what our education system really needs to prepare us for as students, I'm a 26th grader, my mom and dad don't believe I'm out of school, but as students, what it needs to prepare us for is what problems do you want to solve, rather than what companies you want to get into or what jobs are going to be automated away by AI. And those problems are like societal. If, for example, if AI solves poverty, fantastic, why not, right? It's not going to. But people who work on this area are by default going to remain experts that could be better empowered with AI to do their jobs than without AI. Thanks.
I think I'd like to observe that, the today's version is people want to go work for those companies. Yesterday's version was people wanted to go work for the World Bank or WHO. And just like this same pattern, people went in with big ideas, bright futures, a real deeply seated desire to improve the world. And when they got in there, they discovered that the World Bank was actually founded for 2 purposes, and one of them is to spread market capitalism. Like, that's in the charter. Like, just go look at it, it's got purposes. One of them is spread market capitalism. So income young people, and maybe markets are good in some cases, they're just not good in every case. And they're thinking, all right, humanitarian. And then the entire institution is oriented around an objective that is sometimes or often at cross purposes with this humanitarian impulse. And then as a little worker bee, you don't really have access to those structures. So you figure out what's the best thing I can do within them. And that's pretty limited. Same thing happens at Google now. It's like, you remember the old Google when Sarah G. Brin said, this is about democracy. But the new Google is about compliance and money. So don't believe the dream that's out there. Believe your own dream. Keep it alive. Think about how you can realize your principles directly. Once you sell them there at the beginning, you're just on the wrong track. So we have our mics open, and I'm going to continue to monologue and talk with our panelists until somebody objects. But I have a question for, I think first for Anasuya, and that is, we've talked about data, and we haven't yet talked about where data comes from. Like, what is the actual, it's a physical process that generates data. And I know you have some things to say on that. So why don't we give that to our audience and to ourselves?
Thank you, Jesse. And I think it comes from a little bit the back end of what Swapnil was talking about, right? When we say automation of an AI system, the automation is what it looks like on the front end, what we are experiencing sitting at a laptop. But one of the things I often say, and I try very hard not to use the term AI myself, I use variously machine learning or algorithmic systems, because I often say AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. And there are many different reasons for it, from the intelligence perspective, and we can go deeper into that. But, say something like ChatGPT, it simulates human conversation, but it isn't human because it is predicting on past conversations of humans, many of which are highly violent conversations online by very violent humans, which is why we get chatbots that go berserk very quickly. So that notion of independence needs to be questioned, including, as Hannah said earlier, the notion of intelligence itself comes out of a colonial worldview that talked about intelligence as something that some people had and others didn't. if we remember. So if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a duck. So that's one. But the other thing is the artificiality of it, this notion of the automation. Anything that needs data means it will always need enormous amounts of human labor to clean, repair, and maintain that data. And that repair and maintenance work is often in our industry called ghost work because it is invisible. It is often done by laborers, workers in the global south, in places like Kenya, India, Philippines, and for very little money under very inhumane conditions. So OpenAI, for instance, was valued recently at over 150 billion, I think. And workers for OpenAI were paid less than $2 an hour. And this is being paid badly to look at incredibly violent, difficult, extremely problematic, traumatic material with absolutely no support. With obviously, if you're paid like piecemeal, you're paid by an hourly wage, you're not going to go off and get some rest when you need it. And workers are now talking about the kind of PTSD they're developing from this. So I think we have to sort of be really clear that what we are talking about as an automation is the automation at the front end, not at the back end. There are a whole swathe of unknown and unseen humans that are actually helping us work with Stable Diffusion, work with ChatGPT, work with various other forms. And so there's the question, and I may just take that very quickly and answer a little bit Hannah's question, but also the promise piece. I think there's a way then to ask, well, which humans can then look at machine learning, look at this and do it differently, right? And I think that's what all four of us, all five of us, including Jesse, think about a lot. So for instance, on our end, one of the things we think about is, okay, so we have a critique of large language models. We think that they're very unjust. They have deep bias. They are, from the climate perspective, from an energy perspective, they're terrible. What are their alternatives? Can we imagine something differently? What's the seatbelt equivalent, right? And so one of the things, for instance, we do with DARE, which is the Distributed AI Research Institute that Timnit Gebru co-founded. Timnit, as some of you know, was spectacularly fired from Google for a paper she wrote with other researchers around some of the deep concerns we should have around large language models. And so we're working on, okay, what does sovereign language technology look like? What does machine learning look like when communities like us are at the heart of that prototyping, at the heart of that imagining? A lot of what Swapnil does, for instance. What might it look like if communities create the data that they want to use for a machine learning system, and they can steward that data? And as Lynn has talked about, there are really good, for instance, principles of indigenous data by indigenous communities around data sovereignty that we look at. What would that look like? So there are ways in which the promise is not about saying this is bad or good. It is what form and by whom and with whom and for what.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question in the back there. Please, sir.
Thank you. I think the panelists have been talking a lot about the harms, potential harms and real harms of AI. And I was just wondering if I could ask you all to reflect a little bit about, and also agreeing on the fact that we need to resist these. In your view, what is like a viable politics to resist the kinds of AI that are being imposed upon us? And just it's been proven to be very, very hard for a lot of other technological transformations that have come through to us. And so is there anything specific about the way in which AI is creating different kinds of constituencies of winners and losers that we might be able to usefully exploit to make a mass politics around it? But
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I want to also build on what Anasia, my colleague, was saying before me. So if we talk about data sovereignty, and what we talked about earlier, right? So I talk about redlining in data, and then what do we do about that? I just want to flip the whole conversation because a lot of the things that we talk about is really the discourse is led by the big tech. Why do I say this? So sometimes we will talk about, say, privacy or this notion of this and that, data privacy or that. But really what we want to talk about is our rights to data, our rights to the internet, human rights. So when we think about it this way, we talk about our own data sovereignty, our own access to data, and our own power, we're putting ourselves in the front. Because in a lot of international fora that I've been to, it's tech companies driving the discussion and also funding the platform. So for example, GIFCT does the counterterrorism, you have the We Protect Global Alliance, and that's online child protection, you have the Christchurch Call, which looks at extreme violence online and taking down those kind of material, all of them led by tech companies and funded by them. And so what do we do instead when we want to say, okay, data sovereignty? So I talked about redlining in the US, right? The very specific US example. I was at Harvard, so I was a student there, and then we met OpenAI because it's one of those things that Berkman Klein Center did. So we met, very exciting, like last year was such a big thing before ChatGPT came out. And I said, well, we have all this data, and so a lot of it's redlining, it's racist. And so the chap looked at me and said, then what do we do? And the room was like, and I was just like, start again. Why do we continue perpetuating the racist data when we know it's racist? So in financing, housing, healthcare in the US, it's racist. We shouldn't start from that path, what Hannah was talking about. We shouldn't start from that path. We start again from fresh. So then we demand transparency. So as users, we actually collectively have a lot of power. We just that we don't know how to mobilize. I wouldn't say don't know. We're not mobilizing and not collectively using that power. But we can demand transparency and ask to inspect the data sets that's being used to train AI models and say, show us what's being used. Because right now, a lot of it's closed models, right? With the big companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, all the big giants, it's closed models. They don't show us what they're using to train on. They're not showing us how it's being done. But we can argue that, okay, if you're taking our data, if you're using, like open things that we are using to help build your thing, which is what we're doing, we should also have the right to inspect what's going on in there and what does it look like. We know it's biased, but at least that's some kind of measure and some leverage. So I think for me, that's one thing. Another thing that governments and academia can do, funders can do in any form, is to look at ways of data collection that involves us. So Gayatri Spivak, and this is Jesse Bub, he was my professor at Harvard. So I had a hard time reading her, but she's a literary theorist. But she says epistemic violence happens when the people doing the work of data collection are strangers in the data set. That means there are several steps removed from the local context, from the local situations. So you're perpetuating, again, some biases, implicit biases that should not be there. So again, my colleagues have said about this, communities, that's us. How do we get involved if we want to study us, which I don't like, by the way, that whole thing. How do we do it together? How do we do it collaboratively? Is it an open source model? What are we talking about here? But there are ways to do this because the thing is about, let's talk about this together. I sense a lot of it's fear. We come from a position of fear. We should not. We should come from a position of strength.
So yeah, AI, I have to comment. No sense. I'll lay it out very simply and touch on again the points that were discussed here. Three things. One, when you have engineers in your organization building these systems, how often have they gone out into the community and actually seen the problem themselves? Do they actually understand what the population is like? Because a lot of times when you deploy these things, right, like we deployed digital health tools, and then it turns out that when the healthcare workers go to the house of the people that they're serving, the mothers that are supposed to use these tools, their mobile phones are with the husband who's at work, who doesn't come home until 11 p.m. So the healthcare worker never gets to see the woman use it on the phone. And here we are sitting as engineers wondering, why is there no engagement in the way we're expecting, right? When we see mothers asking questions, right, and we use AI to answer those questions, we're like, oh, we use the medically vetted data set. Okay, but like that data set changes. The problems change over time. Who is maintaining that? Who is changing those with the community, right? Third kind of issue, right? When you have organizations that actually try to solve for this, they contract workers, they hire linguists, they hire nonprofit staff. What incentive structures are you creating for them to talk to engineers? They're not going to schedule meetings, they're not going to chat, they're going to both show up in only the group meetings that they have, both present what they have individually, and that's it. That's what you're going to be doing performative, collaborative project development without creating the incentive structure. So don't invest time in people, don't throw people at a problem, try to create systems and incentives to solve those problems first. And then figure out like, okay, where is this data coming from? How to make data work for people? And there you have really interesting opportunities. So we didn't talk as much about the promise, which we will do now. But for example, we're working with a community that speaks a dying language in one part of the world, right? Like AI is actually their only way or currently their best way to try to capture some of those conversations in a way that can be preserved, in a way that can be digitized, in a way that can be created as an artifact. So you create future systems on that data that is at least accounting for that community's lived experiences over decades. So there are opportunities to do this. It is really hard, and it is not a people problem. It is a systems problem first of all, and then a people problem.
I would also echo that. I think we've been talking a lot about data and what it means to have data sovereignty and sort of closed loop systems where we're creating the knowledge and analyzing the knowledge and deciding how we want it to be deployed. And I think something when we're thinking about broader systems is also the design assumptions that begin before we even think about collecting data. So for instance, I spent some time working with low-wage workers in the home care sector. And the home care sector is obviously a growing space, thinking about automation, rise of isolation, a rising elderly population, a range of needs. And you see tech companies coming in with a conceptual understanding of the problem, but not an understanding of what it means every day to do that labor of caring for those who have different abilities, who are elderly, et cetera. And what's interesting is in facilitating those conversations, you see the assumption of optimization and productivity, actually optimizing away the things that are fundamental in creating a caring environment. And so this underscores the importance of, collaborating with communities and having communities essential as part of those design decisions, in addition to designing those themselves, right? So those two things don't happen mutually exclusively. For instance, the assumption that okay, there's too many patients, we need to know who to prioritize, we need better schedules about maybe there's a robot that can release medications at the right time so you don't miss medications. And actually conversations with these workers show that no, delivering medicine is not about just taking the pill. It's about having a conversation, and some of these patients have waited all day to have that conversation. And all of a sudden you see these researchers and these UXR designers like, I hadn't considered how that bureaucratic task that should be optimized away for more care is actually the thing that is allowing these people to have a fulfilled life. And so this is just one example of how it's not just data, it's the design assumptions before we get to that stage, which is why we have an opportunity in this moment to intervene early and proactively before we scale and automate systems that are optimized and proactive and actually create a feedback loop that we don't want.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me add a historical perspective. So does anyone here identify as an English gentleman? What, not even one? Okay. We're living in his world. It's gendered male, it's racialized as white, upper economic class. And there's a history of this. It's a history of knowledge itself. So we've had several questions about knowledge, data, justice. How do you interact with systems in a way that advances equality? How do you resist systems that are based on unfairness? And one place to begin would be in the 1660s. And that's at the dawn of the scientific method itself. So Robert Boyle and other experimentalists, these are the guys who founded the Royal Society. What they were doing is trying to figure out the best way to interrogate nature. And they wanted to reduce their own biases as much as possible. So what they did is they formed this collective. It's now called the Royal Society. They had that name 2 years after they started. So it's really old. And they said, we're going to do experiments. And then when the group of people gathered around, all upper-class English gentlemen, when they agree on what happened, we're going to call that truth. And sometimes, like in the natural science, Isaac Newton was the second generation, so they figured out gravity. They're looking at natural phenomena. So in those cases, it doesn't really matter if we're not English gentlemen, because gravity works in a similar way. However, only gentlemen, so this is only the upper-class English men, could be witnesses to knowledge. So if any of you identify as female, you're out. Gay people, you're out. Poor people, you're out. Black people, no. Only the upper-class English gentlemen had the social standing to participate in the knowledge generation process. So what this means in natural science is, first, the racialization and the gendered nature are less important to the knowledge. They're very important to the social processes, but they're less important to the knowledge because gravity works the same way, chemicals work the same way, and other aspects of the natural world are relatively consistent regardless of the observer. However, this idea of neutrality based on a consensus of English gentlemen runs into limits very, very quickly. What happened as a history is, first, that group used the knowledge of the natural world to gain more power. So the technologies of empire include the steam engine, the later industrialization. It includes all of the mechanization of society. With that extra wealth, that group began exporting its societal ideas. So this isn't like gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. This is like, who matters? What is neutral? They reset the 0 point for the entire world around themselves. So this is why you have to speak English, because it was convenient for them. This is why the crash test dummy is a 6-foot male, because that was convenient to them. This is why the world over, this kind of clothing. Well, that's because it's what they liked. Everything about our world is centered on that. So you can resist, but if you don't want to speak English, then you're just marginalizing yourself in that conversation. If you don't want to dress in a way that that group finds acceptable, well, then you're out. Like, your ability to participate in that depends on your compliance. So this is where you want a resistance strategy. You want to find that resistance strategy that allows you to articulate what it is that doesn't fit for you. And there are lots of ways, probably a majority of ways, that the life of an upper-class English gentleman doesn't suit any of us. The participation that you need is the kind that participation that's necessary to avoid your own marginalization. So you could say, I'm not using WhatsApp and I won't use a cell phone because of the way those minerals are mined in the Congo. Yes, you can say that, but then you don't have a phone and you can't talk to people. So you have to participate in parts of this world. Like, you could say, I'm never speaking English. And if you're Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he ought to have a Nobel Prize in a lot of things, but as a literary person with a worldwide reputation, he eventually could say, I'm no longer writing in English. So until you get to that point, you have to participate. So I'm urging you, keep participating in the ways that make you relevant, but stop participating in the ways that constrain you. Just don't do it. Try not to. Say, well, this product is designed for someone else, and that's an opportunity to start a business or give someone else ideas about businesses they should start. It's time to reorient society around what people want. Now, that's bad for the English gentleman, so they use their power over what data is and what decisions are made to maintain that world. But really think of data as a social hierarchy. So when you agree to these binaries about who people are and what they want, it's like you can say yes and participate, and you can say no or be excluded. What we need to do is get together and say that this no of exclusion is an enormous pool of unmet demand and unrealized rights. And then in that space, we don't need those guys. You know, it's not like we're going to tear down the castle walls. That comes later. But for this first day where they still have all the money, it's just like, let's do something else. Let's create something else, a different reality. And then when they get jealous, they come over, we can have a conversation about what they've been doing. So that's a historical perspective on data. And we're still open for business if you have other questions. We have another 25 minutes or so. And I have more questions. Ooh, look, you saved me.
Hi, so I'm Sarajit. I'm a first year medical student at Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok. So we know that AI nowadays is, coming into various aspects of our life, and you know that, for example, if we think of generative AI right now, we would think of something like ChatGPT, right? And we know that there's no one-size-fit-all solution for everything. So, for example, in various circumstances, there should be a localized solution for each problems, right? But we know that AI relies on data and a lot of data, right? And it's really hard for example, marginalized communities to be able to, being able to have their data documented, or for example, just anything at all, because they don't even have access to the internet. They don't, or, even though they take effect on this too. And so how do you guys view a solution in order to empower these communities, or, the marginalized population, in order to be represented in this? Because as we go on, the disparity will become more and more, right? Because it's so global north centric, but we can't really deny the fact that AI is coming into our lives. And so how do we empower these communities and create their own sovereignty?
I really appreciate this question. This is one of the questions that inspired a lot of my work. And it actually begins with some of the low-tech creative solutions I've watched my community of Palestinians engage with. So for instance, in Al Araqib village in the northern desert of Palestine, they faced over 170 demolitions in the past 60 years. And under the Kyle Brigham Amendment, satellite imagery is blurred and restricted in Palestine, so it's hard to document this for international standards. And so what you see is Palestinians partnering with local organizations to fly kites with film cameras attached. And they use creative software that takes those film cameras and maps them together, and now you have a clear image of destruction. Interestingly, we see, communities of Palestinians in the diaspora collecting pieces of archival maps, and superimposing them, and then hosting mapathons, where aunties and grandmas come together and tell stories about some of the names of these streets. And you have groups of people coding into open source software what those names were, where that street was, and seeing if it exists today. And interestingly, some of those projects actually formed the basis for Durub Navigator, which was an application created by Palestinians to hand draw and take those archives of oral histories, of images from the Ottoman Empire, and launch them into today to create an app that allows Palestinians to navigate through identity-specific routes. So I bring this example not to say that this is the most optimized or efficient way, but it's actually an example of how low tech can be really creative and resilient in the collective. So you see oral history coming together with archive coming together, with community events coming together, with people who don't live in Palestine but understand a need. And when you have these collective systems of care, vis-a-vis information and sharing experiences, the creative use cases are unimaginable. The people in that room didn't know that it would be used to build maps that then get hand-drawn and edited by individuals. They didn't know that it would be used to archive and take those images from El Araqib and put them on a map and say, this is exactly where it happened. Look at this destruction from there and now. So these are just some of the examples that come to mind when we think about creativity. And I think Anasuya mentioned earlier in this talk about when we ask different questions, the results of what comes out of those spaces, we can't predict. And I think that's the beautiful part of centering local knowledge, centering locality, centering community, because we don't know what the output will be. And I think that's where the creativity and resilience and resistance lies.
Anasuya, you want to add something? If not, I can.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Swapnil. Go ahead.
Cool. So, two things that I wanted to point out. Like, I think what Hannah described are the outcomes. I would like to talk about the systems that we can use to perpetuate these kinds of outcomes. And I'll do that with an example. There are a lot of these content moderation outposts that tech companies or especially social media companies set up a while back, a number of years ago, where it's like low-cost labor where people can moderate content outside of, while sitting outside of the country so that the market is cheaper for hiring them, can still be paid market rates, but slightly lower kind of regulatory impact. And you have like a kind of outpost where all of the content gets moderated, comes back. And this is especially for harmful content, violence, CSAM material, child sexual abuse material, illegal content, and so on. At some point, these companies extended this to fact checking, and now in recent times you've seen that fact checking funding has been pulled back, so they're going down. The interesting thing is, though, like companies are divesting themselves of in like funding and incentive structure, funding in terms of content moderation outsourced beyond the country that they primarily operate in, they are investing in data labeling in the same countries where they were previously divesting themselves of these content moderation outposts. So the incentive structure it's not that they can't do it. Like, it's not that it's a logistics issue, because a lot of times they cited, we're not finding enough people speaking the language. We can't invest in every country speaking every language and have someone moderating content from there. But the same companies can still find data labeling contractors who are doing a different kind of job in those same languages for them when suddenly the incentive structures arise that we need to train our language models in multilingual settings. So I think the reason I see a lot of people now working with marginalized communities even more when AI came out is because they recognize that, look, the West is the creator of a lot of the most powerful foundation models, right? What the East, and in previous panels at this very conference, right, people have said that we want to be the use case capital of these kinds of technologies because we have the use cases that the West is never going to have at the scale that the West is never going to face. So they are going to have to come to us, and maybe instead of becoming like foundation model creators, we can become the people who apply those foundation models in the most innovative ways, and that solves our problems. It doesn't solve this power distribution. And I think what we can do and should do is create these incentive structures such that we are activating data from these marginalized communities, giving them a voice, while giving everyone else an incentive to use that data such that net benefit is to society. And that's how I see these systems shifting and perpetuating, hopefully, some of the positive externalities, rather than continuing to promote harms against vulnerable communities as a byproduct of creating AI for the West. Next.
Anasuya, did you have an answer you wanted to contribute to that?
I can come in because I think about this a lot, as you can imagine. So thank you for the question. I think to extend what both Hannah and Swapnil said, I think especially for those of you who are at this conference and do the kind of work you do, we need to rethink who we think of as an expert and what we think expertise is. We really need to expand that notion of expertise. And we need to think about the ways that we are talking about marginalized, or what I often say is minoritized communities, because we're on the margins, but we are the majority of the world. And sometimes we forget that. We forget the strength in that. So we're minoritized through historical and ongoing structures of power and privilege, but we are the majority. What does it mean to be sharing our knowledges on our terms in negotiation with each other, right? And it's one of the things Lynn was talking about in terms of data sovereignty. But so when you think about who you're working with, and I think Swapnil talked about this, Jesse talked about this notion of the neutrality or the subject. What happens when you suddenly say, it's not the patient, but for you, it is someone you are learning from and with about health and well-being? What happens when you see them as experts in their own lived experience? And you are an expert in learned experience and lived experience. What happens when we think of our work as a collection, a combination of lived and learned expertises and experiences? And then what happens, as you were asking, when we bring our knowledges online and share our knowledges, again, on our terms. Now, Lynn will talk about this with much greater expertise than I have, but some communities, indigenous nations, have sacred knowledge that they do not wish to share with the world. And I think that is appropriate that they don't share it. And I'm someone who believes as much as possible in a knowledge commons, but I believe in a knowledge commons in which every community has shared in the knowledge commons on the terms that are appropriate to them, rather than the terms that have been provided to them by those in power, right? And so whether it's Wikipedia, for instance, how do we bring knowledges online onto Wikipedia? And it is the largest, community run and edited encyclopedia of the world. And yet only 1 in 10 editors is identified or projected to be female or non-binary. 20% of the world in the global north writes about 80% of the world. There are more articles about Antarctica than there are about the countries of Africa, right? So how do we work together to shift this and change this? And how do we, even as we do this, think about the communities we're working with as experts of their own knowledges and their own histories, rather than subjects, or rather than even use cases, to be honest, Swapnil, right? I know we use the use case because that is the framework that we are given from a particular Silicon Valley construct, but we're not use cases. We're experts in our own lives and in our own histories and in our own knowledges. So there are multiple ways in which we can do this, but I think that convening of unlikely allies, especially South-South, and to Jesse's point, there's a way in which we resist, in which we do South-South work, so that we are constructing solidarity together around our own knowledges and our own histories. And then there's a resistance to the frame that we're given by a very male, Western-centric notion of the world. And I think we have to do both things simultaneously.
Great. So we have about 15 minutes left. And I know that many of our questions so far have been about practical things. No, Mohammed, go ahead. We have another question here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the session. I really liked all of the examples that you gave and all of the things that you mentioned which have not been mentioned in other sessions. And I have 2 questions, so you can answer either one of them. And if you don't want to answer either, I would just love to hear you all talk because it's amazing. The first one is especially about the idea of the archive that you talked about. And when we're talking about archive and resistance, and how do we hold on to those examples when we are being flooded with information and certain use cases which are portraying us as a white man, as you said. So when we're thinking about those things, how do we think about the archive and resistance, especially when all of the big tech companies are letting go of the misinformation experts as well? So that is question number 1. And the second question is, what role does the state play at this point? Because for indigenous communities and communities all over the world, they will be a point of contact rather than the big companies and the big organizations. Like are supposed to hold them accountable a little bit more than we are right now, because in AI, we have all of these AI hubs being set up all over the place in all these countries and continents. So how do we look at those examples as well? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate this question about the archive and resistance. I spend a lot of time looking at digital archives and how they are rooted in also a colonial logic of documenting erasure, but also gaps in the archives that really we've spent a lot of time thinking about filling in through oral histories, through different forms of text, etc. There's a lot of wonderful research on the archive, and I think open source communities, as Anasuya has shared, also have their own forms of politics. When we think about creating our own archives, there's delineations in how it's done. And so I think something that I found really wonderful in my research is the importance of grounding those discussions in the physical and intergenerational, right? Too often we have only one version or one slice of a community speaking on behalf of the entire community. And so also when we think about partnerships and data and sovereignty, we are not a monolith. Palestinians living inside Gaza have a very different reality of those living inside the West Bank, have a very different reality of those living in the diaspora as myself, and I can't speak on behalf of those living under the bombs currently. But I think this is the beautiful part about thinking critically against the grain in the archive is how do we include the breadth of knowledge and the breadth of intergenerational knowledge and honoring it. And so for me, that's gathering in community, having someone who's coding on an open source platform while a teta or grandmother is telling a story about that place. And then you have a younger person in the room also there. I think that's a form of reclaimal to do that work in the physical if you're privileged enough to do it. And also some of the examples I gave earlier were about thinking strategically about retaining our autonomy over some of these images. So I shared an example of Nightshade, which is a type of sort of critical digital tool that can be used to integrate into pixels that then when they get uploaded can cause AI models to sort of malfunction if the images are being scraped. And so I think there's actually a real opportunity to think critically about moving against this grain of consumption of information for other use cases and thinking about how we can develop really creative resistance strategies to make sure some of that content stays in its context, right? Because too often it's devoid of context. So those are just some initial thoughts, but those are questions that I sit with often and would be happy to talk about it more after. But I defer to you guys on the role of the state and maybe, yeah.
I think it's a really great question. Let's just go back to the archives bit because, it's again like what Hannah is saying, it's a colonial construct. And then it's usually just written documents. And a lot of indigenous societies, ours is based on oral traditions, things that's not really captured easily on paper. So even just like a way of resisting or the way of like deconstructing how we know of knowledge production is to question the concept of the archives. And also the temporal way of doing it too, right? Because it's always systematic, it's every disparate. I want to talk about slow archives and a way of doing that's actually unruly and different and multilinear. Because in my culture, we don't have a linear way of approaching things. It's different. And I would not speak of other indigenous societies. I would speak only on my own society. So that's just on the archives. On states' role, I think it's really great. States can fund some of this work that would be a lot more like low tech, so not necessarily AI, but like initiatives done by indigenous communities, for example, to push back. So for example, you have colonial mapping, like mapping in itself is a process for empire building. But usually you don't actually take the place names of the people's, how we see it. This name is taken away from us and is replaced by something else that the colonizers have done. So there are initiatives, for example, by Native American communities where they have put place names and removed any identifiers. So no geography, like no state lines, no particular colonial names, but the names of the Native American communities. But you wouldn't have access. So again, like what Anastasia was saying, sacred knowledges, you have to ask for permission to use that kind of map. Even it's open resource, but you have to get permission, and you have to ask for permission every single time. So you're respecting the indigenous knowledges, and in this way, it also allows us to reclaim back our land. I mean, we have lost it, but it helps us in our own mapping project. For example, I would love to see something like that. The Malay archipelago, growing up as a child, I would go to Malaysia, go to Indonesia, from Singapore, and not think twice about it. And then growing up, I'm like, oh yeah, we have to get a passport to do something. But basically, our peoples are the same. We speak the same language, we have the same culture, we wear the same thing. So if we can have a colonial mapping, like a pre-colonial mapping process to reclaim what was ours, grounding in physicality, because a lot of like tech is universalizing things. It's all in the ether, it's on clouds, but we are very grounded. We have to remain grounded. And how do you do it in ways where we talk, even on online discourses, right? We are constantly polarizing because the incentive structure is meant to be that way, because they give the most engagement by the most angry outbursts, the most negative things. Let's change that. Let's go for like positive stuff. So like, we can think about, in the Malay culture, we call it gotong royong. So communal spirit, like harvest, building a house together, wedding feast, to cook together. So how do we build that kind of concept, gotong royong, in the online spaces? How do we mimic what we do physically outside and then put it back in online communities? How do we push back against negative and polarization and do it on online social? I have a few ideas, but this can be done because we have to think in a different way and push back against how things are incentivized.
I have an example, exactly to continue Lynn's point. Back in 2024 January, we had, this was around the time of the layoffs in the tech companies, towards the second or third layoffs. There were people who left tech companies and who were like, now there was this cover being taken away where a lot of your life was kind of sorted out for you, right from giving, canteens and food every day, really nice healthy meals, to laundry services and, access to both people, technology, support, and governments in a lot of cases, to now having a loss of all of that and not being used to that kind of system. What we came in to do was we worked with a lot of these ex-tech leaders to create systems where they could continue the same kind of work they were doing internally. They were on the policy side. We created technological systems and we ended up producing this project, which was a small endeavor at the time, understanding political hate and harassment in a particular country, at the time in Bangladesh, and trying to provide material evidence of this happening so that platforms could recognize that this is what is happening. A lot of times we have anecdotes, but we don't have evidence, and so that doesn't lead to any platform enforcement. And that's again because the incentive structures are so set up that you can't just tell a platform what to do. There is no position of expertise. Even governments today cannot tell platforms what to do, and we see that every day online. So we created this evidence where we published reports, gathered data, and showed that here is how these political harassment campaigns might be targeting minority candidates quite more than other candidates, and here is how these public pages and groups tend to promote harms, and this is what harms look like. And bear in mind, we're from India, we didn't speak the language at the time. I'm learning Bangla now because my wife is Bangladeshi. But at the time, we worked with those ex-tech leaders, their local sort of staff, and they had created a non-profit after that. And that report got published, featured in national news. And ultimately, about 2-3 months later, Meta took down a few of those accounts. So it's under their Q1 2024 adversarial threats kind of report. So the point of that is, this was change that was driven entirely externally to a company, but it required those good people at companies that I talked about to actually support us with some kind of data access. And now Meta shut down this tool, so this is no longer possible. They've created a new system, but there are still good people working on the new system to try to give us access so that these kinds of reports can be enabled. Because again, there are a lot of people at platforms who have spent their lives fighting the culture that may or may not be positive, with the intent that is definitely positive. And just to clarify, like this work, the technical side of the work was done by undergraduate students in their first, second, and third years of college from India, without like any kind of special experience or training that they had received, just because we trained them over the years to think about these problems more deeply and care about the people who are facing them. So change is possible from the outside. We're doing it. We'll continue to do it. Join people who are on that side, and you will see it happen for yourself. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that question. We have one more. We've got 2 minutes left, so let's just get this question on the floor, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm Nashanon from Ramatibadi Hospital. I actually have something which I feel it's a bit paradoxical, Because on one hand, I can see that it's quite inspiring that the rise of AI will allow people to do more creative jobs, in a sense that people can use AI in a way that is more creative to do something which they can express their creativity using AI to do things which are less creative, right? So it's something like a creation of creative economy. But I think it's paradoxical because of two problems, and I want to know whether this is right, what I'm thinking. First, I think that because we don't really understand how AI works, right? If we are to define AI as something which are extracting patterns in order to create more patterns, if we say that creativity is something which arises from old patterns, then wouldn't those creativity essentially able to be done by AI? Or more specifically, if we say that it's not exactly the patterns that they learn from the data, but they are actually kind of extrapolating to something which the data is not giving them, doesn't that mean that if we define creativity as something like that, doesn't that mean that AI can also do the same thing as us by being creative, by having a certain like mathematical functions like human brain, which is able to extend from the normal data to become something which is more creative? So that's the first problem to the problem that I think that whether we can really have a creative economy or not with the rise of AI. But the second more important problem is that like I try to define from first principle as well what actually it means to become creative, right? And actually come to terms with the idea that maybe it's something that invokes a certain like novelty in a personal human experience. For example, I might say that something is creative to me when I heard someone say it might be creative to me because I have never heard of those things before. So that means that any sufficiently complex or novel ideas could actually be defined as creative, right? The problem with that I see is that if that is the definition of creativity, then wouldn't AI be more creative than us because it does not have personal subjective experience, but actually has a collective experience of everyone in society. So of course, we might not be able to say that it's more creative than the universal alien population, but at least we can say that with all the knowledge and all the experience that are collected into AI, at least it will be more creative than anyone combined. So I'm not sure whether this is the peril of the creative economy or not. Because of these two problems, I really want to hear your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're out of time, and we should take that as a sidebar. I'll apologize to our panelists. We won't get to that, and I'm sorry about it. I just want to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. And one of those is that the basis for a more fair and better world is dignity and respect for each other. If you have that, then you can learn from each other. With that basic understanding, then everything else becomes possible. And where we're beginning is where I was talking about a minute ago, that you're all occupying a world of upper-class English gentlemen. So for the part of you that conflicts with that, take some pride in that and share it with others. Believe in it. That's the part that's special. The universalized stuff, not so much. So who went to the dinner last night? Yeah, okay. And do you know that food you ate? That was the English gentleman food, right? Yeah, and you went there with English gentleman clothes and stuff like that. So maybe next year we could express our opinion that we want some like Thai food. Isn't that a good idea? I think it's yum. I think we should unite around expressing what we want. And for me, that would be some Thai food, but you guys can all say. So with that, I just have one apology to make, which is, when you were asking your question, or you started to ask a question, I thought you were Muhammad. And so I said Muhammad, but then when we were speaking, I was like, no, that's not Muhammad. And then the real Muhammad came in. So we'd like to know your actual name. No, not you. Yeah, the Muhammad, the fake Muhammad.
It's Samin.
Samin, okay, sorry, my bad. Okay, so that's another lesson. You make a mistake and you apologize. Samin, we see you. Thank you. So thanks everyone for coming.